Hi guys, and welcome to the next lesson in research methods. After the appalling jokes, my wife has decided to contribute, so here's her favourite joke. What do you call cheese that's not yours? Nacho cheese. Yeah, you can tell me whether that's better than my jokes or not, because I don't think it is. Anyway, we have, and you'll be pleased to hear this, we have covered the majority of the main research methods that sociologists use. And we're going to move on now to just some kind of smaller parts of the topic that just need to be tied up neatly. You need to know what they are, know a bit about them before we move on to a new topic. But we are getting towards the end of research methods now, so it's kind of the finishing off bits, which should be fairly straightforward to do. So that's what we're going to start today, is we're going to look at 3 of those, and then we'll move on next lesson. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is something called longitudinal studies. Now, as the name suggests, the whole point of these is that they're done over a long period of time. Most research collects data over a very, very short period of time. It might be, a matter of hours or even minutes that the research and the data is collected. And the point of these studies is to have data collected over a much longer period of time, years really, from the same sample of participants. And that really provides us with our first strength. Okay, the argument there is that it's more valid because it gives us changes over time. It can show us changes over time. Whereas a one-off snapshot, it might be, it could be a valid reflection of how participants are feeling and thinking that day. But who's to say that next week they don't have a very different thought and feeling going on? And so that we can't necessarily say that it's as valid as when we get data from the same people over a number of years. So it might be, every 3 months for 5 years. If that's consistently giving us a conclusion, we could say that's a lot more valid than a snapshot would be. So that's one of the biggest strengths there. Another strength is the idea that you can work out the causes of the changes. So again, this idea that because it's the same sample of participants, it's the same people doing these questionnaires, interviews, whatever it happens to be, over this long period of time. You know that your results, your changes that have taken place, aren't anything to do with your sample, because the sample stayed exactly the same. It's not made up with different people with different characteristics. It's made up of exactly the same people. So because you aren't changing the sample's not changing, you can much more likely be able to establish a cause and effect kind of relationship. You're much more likely to work out the causes of what's going on in your data. That being said, that links and pairs really well with the most important weakness of longitudinal studies, which is something called sample attrition. Now, attrition means like a weakening or a lessening. And what inevitably happens in real life is you get this sample of lots of different people, and you're trying to keep them together for over years and years, and people drop out. It's the nature of human people that we're not necessarily going to be able to stay at something for that long. And there's all kinds of different reasons why people would drop out, but that affects your sample. One of the key issues with sample attrition as well is that it affects the representativeness, because it's entirely possible that it's the same kind of people, the people with the same kind of characteristics, that are left in the study. For example, imagine the longitudinal study requires you to attend an interview every 3 months for 5 years. The poorer people would have to, travel to the university where this interview is conducted, and that costs them money. Whereas the rich people, that's less of an issue for them. So it might be that the poorer people who can't afford the transport costs have to back out, or choose to back out of the longitudinal research, and it's just leaving the rich people in. Now that means you've got an unrepresentative sample, because you've got all of the people that have the same kind of characteristics, same economic status, and they're the only ones giving you the data, giving you the research. So that's one of the biggest issues with longitudinal studies, is that lots of people drop out. Could be up to half the people drop out of your sample. The other issue, which is unsurprising, is that it's incredibly time consuming, and because of that can also be very expensive. One sociologist called Parker studied a load of about 1,000 illegal drug users over a 5-year period, and that cost £380,000. So it's a significant investment of time and money because of the nature of the fact that it's longitudinal. And individual sociologists would have to work out whether the extra validity that you get from getting more than just a snapshot in time is worth the effort and the cost and the number of years that you'd have to spend conducting the research. Okay, so writing up then, quick definition of longitudinal studies and key aspect of it, and then a couple of strengths, a couple of weaknesses on the table in the relevant box, and that's task 7.1. Now the next part of task 7.1 is to look at case studies, okay, and to write the relevant description and strengths and weaknesses in the box. So here goes. Case studies are a very detailed, in-depth look at one example of whatever it is the researcher is interested in. So it could be like one family that are working class. It could be one particular individual who's a drug user, or whatever it is. But it's one example, and they can often can potentially use any research method we've discussed already, or even several methods throughout their time. But it's this kind of in-depth, detailed look that they're trying to get at. Sometimes they're called life histories, which gives you an idea of the kind of level of depth that a case study is trying to achieve. Because of that depth, even though any method can be used, it tends to be the qualitative ones. Okay, it tends to be the unstructured interviews, maybe supported by analysis of personal documents, like diary entries and things like that. So it's something that interpretativists are probably more likely to use than positivists, but it can be used by either and with any method. Now, because it's only one example, one participant, so you say, it could be a very small group, it could be one gang or one class in a school or something like that. But the idea is it's only one example. You don't compare other classes. They're not involved in research or anything like that, which means that it's highly unrepresentative. Okay, we cannot say that particular example, the individual drug user or whatever it is, their results can be generalized to the wider society. It's incredibly unrepresentative. So that's your first weakness. The second weakness is that often the data is gained from people's memory. Okay, so it's researchers asking about, particularly when we're talking about life history, events that took place years, decades before. And the issue with that is that memories aren't always accurate. So they might be just simply flawed. They might be kind of coloured by events that have happened afterwards, that might kind of make you feel like something had a different meaning than it did at the time. Anything like that. We just can't say really that studying or data gained from memory, from particularly memories going back a long way, it's likely to have less validity than something that's happened immediately and is fresh in the memory. So those are your two weaknesses. Now, the strength of it is that it allows that massive level of depth and detail. Okay, and what that means for interpretativists anyway, that because there's far more detail, there's far more understanding. We get more understanding. Yeah, which essentially for them would make it more valid. The other kind of strength of it is that you can use case studies to kind of develop hypotheses. So it might be that you are thinking about investigating a particular area, and you study this one example of participants in that area, and realise actually, this is a topic that's worth investigating. This is something that we need to spend a lot more money on by doing a massive kind of big, large-scale questionnaire or a participant observation or whatever it happens to be. But you get the idea that the fact that you can kind of, it's almost like a way of testing out to see whether further research is warranted. And in that way, it can direct your hypotheses. Because you get so much depth and data and detail, you can direct your hypotheses for further research. So there you go. That's case studies. Again, task 7.1, description or definition in the relevant box, and then a couple of strengths, a couple of weaknesses. The last new thing we're going to look at today then is methodological pluralism. Now, methodological basically means anything to do with research methods, to do with the methods themselves, and pluralism means more than one. So methodological pluralism means when sociologists use more than one research method. It's easy to imagine that sociologists are either completely positivist or completely interpretivist, and therefore they only use the methods that kind of fit those perspectives. But in the real world, in reality, it doesn't work like that at all. Okay, the vast majority of sociologists won't be completely positivist or interpretivist. They'll be somewhere in the middle. Imagine it as a scale. And they might lean slightly more to one side or the other, but they're never completely one or the other. And they'll use a variety of methods because they value both quantitative, I really do hate that word, quantitative or qualitative data. Okay, so they'll use more than one research method, and that gives them a much fuller picture. Particularly when we're talking about within the same topic or the same piece of research. If they're using a quantitative source of method and a qualitative method to get data, that's going to give them a much fuller picture than if they just used one or the other. Now, going hand in hand with methodological pluralism is something called triangulation. Okay, and this is when a researcher will use more than one method to kind of check the validity of the other methods that they've used. So often they use three. That's why it's triangulation, three, to check that their results are valid. For example, they might use observations to check whether what people said they did in an interview is what was actually going on. So the observation then is checking up on the interview, which then can prove or improve validity. Yeah, and it might be that they use official statistics to then back up both of those two things, the observations and the interviews. So you get this triangulation to prove or to improve the validity, to check that the other method's results are valid. And so they use more than one method, so it's methodological pluralism, but it's not just a case of trying to get the fullest picture, it's doing it to make sure that the results that they get from each method are valid. So you can see how those are very closely linked things, but slightly different. And in your notes that you're making, which is still task 7.1, can you make sure that you highlight the distinction and the difference between methodological pluralism and triangulation? So try and get that very clearly in your mind and in your notes. Methodological pluralism, using more than one method, quantitative and qualitative, to get a fuller picture. Triangulation, using more than one method to try and make sure that the results you get from each method are valid. I also want you to include an example in your notes. So the example I'm going to give you is from a piece of research by the Social Issues Research Centre. It was done in 2011, and it was called The Changing Face of Motherhood. So it's all about what it's like to be a mother. So they used 4 different research methods. They started with official statistics, so secondary data, official statistics, going back from the 1930s. So a good kind of 80 years of data there. They also used an online self-completion questionnaire. So both that and the official statistics got them a lot of quantitative data, and there was about 1,000 people in the questionnaire. But they, on top of that, they used focus groups, like group interview focus groups, and unstructured interviews, individual unstructured interviews, to get the qualitative data. And so there's a whole, depth and variety of data there, each checking up on the other methods to make sure it's valid and getting the fullest picture possible to find out what life is really like as a mother. Okay, so task 7.1 is to write the definition of methodological pluralism in as much detail as you can. And I've said several things about it. Don't just give me 3 or 4 words, please. And same for triangulation. And then give the example that I just put in the relevant box on the Word document. Right, so all throughout today's lesson, I've been talking about task 7.1, which would imply that there's a 7.2 and 3 and 4, etc. I've actually changed my mind. We're not going to do that. What we've got is 2 weeks until half term. And so for summer term task 7, which is those 3 things that I've already talked about, make notes on that. Get the Word document completed and email me the evidence. That's fine. I'm going to set you task 10 today so that you've got 2 weeks till the half term, 2 weeks to complete it. So you've got plenty of time to get it done. I know some of you are still working on your content analysis bit, which was task 6.5. That's fine. You've still got plenty of time to get it all done. And task 7 isn't taxing. It's not a big deal or a lot of work. So you should get that done relatively quickly. Now, task 10 is the second document that I sent in the email. And when you open it up, you'll notice it's a table, and it's got a list of all the different research methods, the main ones that I've talked about, and ultimately you're completing the table. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is to give a description of each research method. Make sure that it's not just 1 or 2 words. Make sure it's got the right amount of detail. So we are what we're creating is a summary table. It is an overview of all the key information in one place. So it doesn't have to be the same level of depth as your notes are. Most of your notes, some of them are a bit light on detail, but it doesn't have to be the same level of depth as your notes. But it does need to be enough to be able to serve you well when you revise from it for your exams. Bearing in mind that you will get a 20-mark question on research methods in your end of year 1 assessment, whether that's done in college or at home. That's what's going to be happening. So you do need to be able to know this stuff. So like I was saying, first thing is to complete the description. And then comes slightly more tricky bit. I want 4 strengths and I want 4 weaknesses. But they need to be the kind of most significant or relevant strengths and weaknesses. For example, if you're talking about participant observation and you're not mentioning the ethical issue of deception, then you're not thinking straight there. You're not talking about the most relevant or significant things. So I want 4 strengths and weaknesses. You need to identify whether it's practical, ethical, or theoretical. If it's to do with validity, if it's to do with representativeness, if it's to do with reliability, those are all really theoretical issues. So highlight using those keywords. If that's what the strength or weakness is about. Remember, one thing that you can always say is whether positivists are in favour of it or interpretivists are in favour of it. That's something that can always be part of it. And what I also want you to do, and this is probably the trickiest bit, but it will be the thing that will make the biggest difference to your essays and your marks, is I want you to do your best to pair up the strengths with the weaknesses, so that when you're writing a paragraph, you'd be going through whatever the strength happens to be, and then have the most relevant weakness to criticize it. So if I'm taking for example, the weakness of the ethics and deception in participant observation, I would partner that with the strength of validity. The reason being that the deception, the whole point of the deception, is so that the participants don't know you're watching them, so they behave in the most natural way and avoid the Hawthorne effect. And that increases validity. So I'd partner those 2 things up. Okay, that would be my strength and my weakness that I'd put on the same level in my table and in the same paragraph in my essay. Now, it's not always a perfect partnership. Sometimes, they won't work. There aren't the ones that are particularly relevant to each other. But for most methods, there is at least 1 or 2 strengths and weaknesses that pair up really well. So I want you to think about that very carefully when you're completing this document. I would do it in Word because you've then got the space to adjust the boxes to the right size for you. If you can't manage that with the kind of technical provisions that you've got at the moment, you haven't got a laptop or whatever to do, then do it on paper, but make sure you leave yourself plenty of space. It might be an A3 sheet of paper. You might need to go on the back, whatever. Make sure you've got enough space. But the idea is you have all the information from research methods in one document, one table, and it would essentially form an essay plan for any, you could get a question on any of those methods, and you in this table would have an essay plan for any of those methods with the strengths and weaknesses there. I hope that all makes sense. If it doesn't, drop me an email and ask me what's puzzling you, and I will do my best to sort that out. So like I said, I'm going to give you a good 2 weeks to complete this document. So we've got a couple more lessons that will still come out in that 2 week time frame, but they won't carry as much work as some of the previous ones. So you should be able to get this done in that 2 week time frame. Okay, I hope you're all staying safe, looking after yourselves and your families, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys soon, because this lockdown is really quite annoying. All right, take it easy.